Good morning. Let's have a deep breath, right? We're coming to the end of day 3. We're imagining supply chains of the future. We're building a guiding coalition. We're going to have to wait one more minute before we really go live because I have to be synchronized with the virtual event. And I actually learned that if I go early, I really cause an upturn in the apple cart. So I got to fill an extra minute here, but thank you for coming from breakfast. All right, so putting on an event is a lot of work, and I really appreciate all of you coming. Today we're going to continue our journey of imagining, right? Of imagining the supply chain of 2030, and I'm hoping that 2030 doesn't look like 2020, doesn't look like 2010, doesn't look like 2000, doesn't look like 1900, but we've not made a lot of progress. You know, we're stuck. We're stuck in our mental models. We're stuck in our organizational concepts. I was reflecting yesterday because a number of people online said, how do I make this change, right? It's just me and the organization, and how do I influence the organization to think bigger, to change the mental model, to get out of the traditional mindset of, you know, large technology vendors have the answer or large system integrators have the answer. How do I do this? And so today I'm going to talk about the how with stories. And I'm going to challenge people to think about building those mental models in the guiding coalition, because I really think that people talk about change management, but they don't really challenge themselves to unlearn. Often I go into a company and there'll be a team that hasn't worked together before, and they say things like supply chain excellence, but they don't really stop and think that each of them come to the table with a very different mental model, and they need to have a discussion about what is supply chain excellence. And that they need to unlearn, to relearn, to build better. And that unlearning process, you know, you saw the backward bike, must precede change management. Because if you don't unlearn, you can't go forward. So for example, I talk to Madhav a lot in Coupa, and I say the term design, when you say it, has a fixed paradigm that people think about a project and they think about a bricks and mortar implementation. They don't think about the vision that Allison Fowler gave us yesterday. They don't think about design as a flow, as design as a way to coordinate all the engines. Most people have a simplistic view of planning of a single engine or a couple of planners. They don't see the more holistic picture. And so this unlearning needs to happen in lots of places in the supply chain. And it isn't as easy as riding the bike, right? Knowledge does not equal understanding. I had an email overnight from a consultant that has been in the audience, and he said, I now understand better what you've been telling me for 2 decades, Lora. That we don't have the answers. And I understand that from hearing from Toro and Clorox and Sleep Number. And he thanked me. He said, you know, I've never seen the depth of presentations that were on stage yesterday, which I was really thrilled with the presenters. And I said, yes, this is the heart of supply chain management. It is leadership. It is the ability for influence skills. It's the ability to tell stories. People will remember Kevin talking about, you know, lasagna, you know, a long time out of this conference. They'll remember Rick on stage talking about he casually asked a guy in sales to come to his training, and the commercial teams then said everybody at Clorox needs to go to the training. It's the only company I know of that has trained sales and marketing on the principles of supply chain management. And isn't it ironic that that has happened, but yet 80% of employees in a manufacturing or retail company are in supply chain? I mean, I just find it fascinating. And I also find it ironic that most of our academic programs in the United States report through the marketing department in business, without a real understanding of how do we broach that chasm between operations and marketing. Now, sometimes people say, well, Lora, I can't really drive the concepts that you're talking about. It's just me, I'm in the supply chain. I can't really drive, the impetus that you're talking about. This groupthink that is kind of a dark cloud over supply chain. And the groupthink is heavily fueled by system integrators that may have the knowledge but don't have the understanding, by event companies that put lots of people on stage but don't really vet them to say, are they driving results? Or strategies that aren't tethered in definitions. So last night, I took the group to the Air and Space Museum. Wasn't it wonderful? Yeah. I just love seeing the Enola Gay and hearing the story about the pilot that knew he had a nuclear bomb and, the impetus there, right? Or Amelia Earhart and seeing that refurbished plane. So what I want you to do now, 10 minutes in your dialogue, I want you to abstract from the Air and Space Museum, what was your favorite story about how a dream took flight? Where the docents were great. So talk amongst yourself. The Air and Space Museum, innovation, your favorite story. All right. Okay, are we ready to share? Bill, Regina had to run out. Can I ask you to run a mic?
Sure.
And Nicole, can you grab another mic? And I remember when you talk in the mic to hold the mic up to your mouth so that you're not doing this or you're not doing this. Hold your mic up to your mouth because we're recording this and I want everybody to hear you. So Alma, Jenny, Marie, tell us about the great experience that shared at your table.
We had two. One was there was a missile in the corner, and one of the docents was saying that it had failed 28 times before it was finally successful the 29th time. So we thought that was a good example of you have to keep trying, and then you get to that success. And then we were noticing, Laura, that first question that you had asked the docent about a great story from the Air and Space Museum. And he talked about ecosystems and designs and how different parts of the plane really needed to work together. And those pilots and those programs that recognized that were the ones that really had the most success.
Yeah. I asked that question and I didn't expect such a home run answer, right? Because he talked about system theory and we couldn't really, just look at aviation absent the pilot, the fuel, how the systems were put together. It was a home run answer, right? And I was struck by the World War II exhibit, and they talked about how Germany focused on the aircraft, and they could build the aircraft, but they didn't focus enough on pilots and fuel for the aircraft. And so they had actually produced more aircraft than they could fly after the Normandy invasion. I found that very interesting too. So that system theory I thought was really great, and that docent was fantastic. Okay, let's move to Christine, your table. Madhav was there. And
we talked about a myriad of things, but the first thing that we talked about was the SR-71 and the function that it had and the job that it did. But then the technology really surpassed it, and we moved beyond it. And yes, there was still a beauty in the aircraft itself, and it has a place in history. But I think what we've seen in aviation is just this constant drive for innovation. They never were happy with where they were, and they always moved forward, and they continue to move forward. We see that today with Artemis, right? It feels like one of the things we talked about is that as a culture, somehow we've forgotten that failure is good, right? Artemis has scratched, twice, 3 times? And it's like the end of the world. Oh my gosh, how have we failed? But to your point, the rocket failed, more than 20 times, and it was still a success in the end.
But we don't create environments that people feel comfortable in failure, right? Because they're not experimenting. And we don't have that environment where they feel like they can test and learn and fail forward. And because of our project mindset, that this is technology, I'm going to bolt in, I'm going to have a well-defined project, I think we missed the boat on that evolution. So that really spoke to me too. Bill, your table?
I'm going to pass it off, but one thing that struck me was seeing the Concorde.
Yes.
And realizing that we're flying at the same speed that people flew 60 years ago.
I know, isn't that incredible? I actually feel very honored that when in my 20s I got to fly the Concorde twice. And I didn't really appreciate the experience at the time, right? And it was the redefinition of time, but it was not significant enough that I felt like it was worth the value. And I don't think we think enough about time and the supply chain in the right way. I don't think we think about process latency, data latency, but we're looking at real-time data. And real-time data introduces nervousness. So this whole concept of time and the Concorde, and as I reflected in my personal experience, was very insightful for me.
Yeah.
I also think about Fred Smith and his startup of FedEx and the fact that his initial proposal was turned down because people thought no one will pay to have a letter delivered overnight, right? So this whole element of time and the value proposition of time is something I was thinking about from that discussion. Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the things that surprised us also is that technologies started at the same moment at different places and at different forms, and then in the end it concurred, of course, but like the English jet engine and the German jet engine were totally different,
Yes.
but same ideas. That was more Anapam product design, and from my side it was more like, if you see the X1, the first guy flying through, it's a lot of human guts also, to embrace technology,
Right.
and take your place. And
Right.
and I think this whole museum is a
Right.
homage, to these people also.
So if you think about supply chain and we think about all the technologies that are emerging, whether it's software robots, warehouse robots, driverless cars, electric cars, last mile delivery, redesign of the middle mile, design as flow, redesign of planning, sensing, we got a lot happening. We just aren't cooking it on the stove, yeah? Okay, let's shift the mic. Matt, do you have the mic? Or, JB.
JB.
Okay.
And of course, we're last, so ditto with what everybody has said. I think the only thing we would add is that none of that would have happened without a really serious leadership, right? Because you're not willing to take risks, you're not willing to let the organization accept failure unless you have serious leadership. And that was our biggest observation.
Well, let's talk about what is serious leadership. I'm hoping you saw serious leadership on stage yesterday. Impressive leadership. And what are the characteristics of that leadership that you would say, yes, JB was serious? What were the characteristics?
Conviction.
I'm sorry, conviction. Yeah.
I think what I saw was a lot of empathy, which I would contrast to when I started in the 90s, in the late 90s. Even though the leaders might have had empathy, they didn't display it, and it was really hard to relate to them. And I think what I saw on stage yesterday and the day before were leaders that were empathetic and they were human, and that you could relate to them.
The interesting thing is the supply chains to admire winners tend to be human and empathetic versus a lot of the leaders that I see at other conferences tend to be more of, I've got the answer, and are less approachable. So that was a big takeaway for me. They were affable, approachable. They engaged they listened. That was, I think, for me, what I got out of that serious leadership. What else did you observe? Nicole?
We had the discussion that all of these planes served a need, and once the need was fulfilled or gone or not existing anymore, more from that point, we now see drones And I was then reflecting, what will be in the Air and Space Museum in 50, 100 years from now?
Yeah.
Will we have only drones, only public transport, so planes serving mobility? What will be worthwhile visiting a museum in 100 years? So what will be the need? And also to observe that technology from the beginning was there, maybe for the sake of technology. I don't think that the people who invented the first plane, the brothers, that they really thought of all the possibilities, all the use cases. So I was for myself reflecting when you showed the graph yesterday of all the different technologies. This is a kind of innovation which happens, and we don't know yet the use cases. But now, 100 years looking back, we see all the possibilities. And maybe it's a little bit similar to the technology. So there is an innovation spark. We don't know yet why we do it. So passion is driving technology maybe from the beginning, and then it's industry to make use cases out of it. And also let them go when the need is not there anymore. Yeah.
Right. I think that's really a great contribution. Thank you. I was struck when my docent, which I was walking with Bill, said that the Wright brothers were not appreciated in the United States, that they had to go to Europe to gain appreciation. And I was struck, if you remember, Deming was not appreciated in North America. He had to go to Japan, which just really, sparked a whole discussion on quality. And so part of it is not invented here, being open to the outcome. Sometimes, a profit in its own country is not really understood. But that spoke to me. And also, as we think about the drones, right, I remember a client I was working with that had a private fleet that they flew people from point A to point B, but they had drones. And they flew the drones over their manufacturing plants to look at safety. And I said, why aren't you flying the drones over the ports to look at lead time, number of ships there, and use pictures to really capture lead time to feed it into your planning systems? And they went, we haven't thought about that. Or why are you not using the RFID devices on your rail cars that are sitting at your customers as a demand signal for upstream demand? And they're like, we haven't thought about that, right? So all of these new technologies give us opportunities to spark innovation if we're open. Anything else? Yes, Christine?
I think the other common thread that I saw at Air and Space and I saw with the leaders that presented was a passion, right? Even your examples with the Wright brothers and Deming, they had a passion.
Yes.
And they couldn't fulfill it maybe in their home country, but they continued to pursue that passion. And I think that is also what we saw with great leaders. They had a vision, they knew where they wanted to go, and they continued to press that until they were successful.
Right. So people that have passion in the organization. Peter, you got a comment? I'm sorry.
Yeah, just the same type of comment, but if you look at that, what we saw, every one of those were different. They were different implementations of a single physical reality. So how that implementation was viewed, that was the first one, is that this amazing variety over a period of time.
Yes.
The second one is that to bring those into reality required a team of people, an investment, the time, and of course what we didn't see is a huge warehouses of all the ones that didn't make it.
Exactly.
And that failed. That would be 20 times its size.
Right.
But that was important, that I guess just the variation in the implementation of how you could exploit this physical property. And it addresses what you just said in terms of why can't we use drones to fly over Los Angeles where the ships are and track them? Why can't we? I think that the technology is there. It's our ingenuity of how to exploit it. And you need a team of people to come together with a vision, of course, but you're going to need the funding. Every one of those aircraft there took a lot of money to put together and a lot of effort. Of course, I didn't notice any balloons there. They were spacious, but we may be revisiting that technology.
Yeah, no, I agree. So let me tell you a story, because sometimes being a change agent is really tough, right? And Rick McDonald yesterday talked about coaching, and I asked Rick, how can employees be more coachable? So in the 1980s, I was fired from Clorox by a peer of Rick McDonald's. And I actually wrote about this article on LinkedIn, and I had my boss write about coaching Lora. So my boss drew this picture on a piece of paper. And he said, Lora, you are really good at your job, which is the first thing you got to be as a change agent. He says, and your circle of control, which is what I asked you to do, has gotten more and more effective. So congratulations. But you are not good at building influence. You are such a workaholic and so heads down, you are not spending time to build relationships to bring people along with your journey. And I want you to think back to Rick McDonald having that relationship with the sales team leader that he casually asked to come to the training session, which changed Clorox and I think lifted Clorox. I want you to think about Kevin, who went to that plant during COVID and got a hotel room, an apartment down the street, and wore his jeans to build influence management, right? So as a change agent, one of the things you've got to do is invest time in building relationships and building an understanding of supply chain and not be a victim, not wear your heart on the sleeve, but tell stories, right? Kevin's lasagna story is a perfect example of how you build influence management. The better we are at stories, the better we are at abstracting concepts into stories, the better we are. One of the things we've got to teach people coming out of school is how to build influence management skills, how to tell stories, how to diffuse issues with laughter. I remember when I was leading the distribution center for Dreyer's Grand Ice Cream, which became a division of Nestle, I started up a new warehouse, and we shipped $420 million worth of ice cream over a weekend, and we installed warehouse management in 1984, which warehouse management in 1984 was ugly. And we brought up the pick the next day, which ice cream is heavily picked. Can we keep it a little lower down there in the corner? So ice cream is heavily picked, and when we brought up the warehouse management system the next day, which was the Friday before Thanksgiving, we dropped all of the vanilla ice cream off the pick, right? Everybody knows what a pick list is. So the warehouse management system dropped all the vanilla ice cream off the pick. Now, the most sought after ice cream for Thanksgiving is vanilla ice cream, right? Everybody wants vanilla ice cream on their apple pie or their, pumpkin pie. And I remember this guy, Dennis, who led sales, and, our Monday morning team meeting, and he got up and he was just in a rage, and he says, Lora, how could you drop all of the ice cream that was vanilla off the pick? And I said to Dennis, Dennis, you flatter me to think I have that kind of power. And everybody laughed. Laughter is an amazing diffusion of a really hairy issue, right? I said, I would not have had that power, right? I worked all weekend, we brought new employees in, we brought temporary workers, we had to chip up the ice, right? I would flatter me that I have that power. But my issue at Clorox was I went from control to concern, right? So the circle of concern are the things that you want to change, but you can't influence. And the goal is that you have to build influence to be able to encompass the circle of control. And as you do that, you become a more powerful leader. And this was a great gift for me from my boss at Clorox. I kept this in my office for 5 jobs later because Lora always saw what needed to be fixed, but wasn't able to build the influence in the guiding coalition to fix it, right? And, I actually had a boss when I was at General Foods who said I was the best misguided missile he had ever managed, right? He said, you know, you are so targeted and you see the problem so quickly that you want to just go there, but you have to help people on your journey. So with that, I want to play a video. And at first, you're going to think this is the craziest video. Why is Lora playing this video? But I want to play this video, and then I want to talk about it. Play the video. So you might say, well, why did Lora play that crazy video, right? Because I feel like the guy that's dancing in the middle of the field without a shirt on, right? You know, I'm trying to build a guiding coalition of people that, you know, are like, what? You know, I remember when I left AMR and Gartner and I started writing on LinkedIn, right? And at that point in time, I had 6,000 people who followed me on LinkedIn. And I sent a thank you note to everybody I'd worked with in my previous analyst relations, thanking them, telling them what I was going to do, and inviting them to follow me on LinkedIn. And up until that point in time, I really discounted LinkedIn as a really important asset. And then I started my first blog. It took me a week and a half to write my first blog, to understand how to blog and, you know, that whole thing. And, you know, now I love to write, right? And I love people that interact with me on LinkedIn. But the journey of building 340,000 followers on LinkedIn is a lot like this guy in the middle of the field. Will anybody read my blog? Will anybody really care? Will anybody come to my conference? Will anybody really think about outside-in processes, right? And you've got to have the courage to stand in the field. And it's people like Christine, who are like the guy in the green shirt, who keep coming back, right? Or Bill, right? Who keep believing, right? And so you've got to build that influence to really drive a guiding coalition. So every now and then I play this and think about what it's like to be dancing in the field alone and looking like the crazy guy. And I want you to leave this conference thinking about, how do I move from brainwriting, of writing my concepts, to building influence management, to building the guiding coalition, to build that team effort in the field. And I want you also to challenge the paradigms that are out there, because they're a lot like the hammer and the nail, right? I have this one guy on LinkedIn, and I can write about flowers or weather, and he always comes back and he says, just do S&OP better. You know, it's the hammer, I've got the nail, right? I got the nail, I got the hammer, right? Just do S&OP better. And in 2004, I wrote a lot about S&OP. I had a strong belief that S&OP could drive organizational alignment. I no longer believe that. And I don't believe that because of political bias, the lack of alignment, the lack of clarity of supply chain excellence, and the fact that most executives don't understand supply chain. So today we're going to talk about talent. I'm going to take you back through what I thought were really pivotal slides from yesterday, and I'm going to talk about how you can take the models that I just talked about and interpret them from the slides Then I'm going to be joined on stage with Jenny, who's going to talk about academia and building the learning model. When Kevin had this slide, I went, yes, right? The fact that we have plan, source, make, and deliver reporting to the same organization is a characteristic of a serious leader, to JB's point. The fact that I have engineering, quality, safety, HR, IT, finance as part of the slide. When you know that a company is in trouble is when they show you a slide that just has logistics or manufacturing or procurement, right? And this slide, when he talked about people and he talked about wellness of people and he talked about empathy for people, career paths, I'm like, check. And then when Rick talked about customer centricity, right? All three talked about customer centricity, but when he talked about the death of undifferentiated formats and the movement of how his products got to the shopper and what that meant to the product line and complexity, Clorox is the only company I know of that has taken complexity into design. They look at the long tail complexity as they tie to design flow, and then they have that training with the sales group where they go through mandatory training in marketing and sales to understand the impact of complexity on the supply chain. It's the only company I know of that's done that. And that only happened through influence management. Then I talked about the need for the supply chain reset. I talked about these concepts as, let's think about these when you go home. Do you have a clear definition of excellence? Are you using Allison's approach to design your supply chain, not as a project, but flows? Have you thought about effective networks, right? Multi-tier processes. I do not believe that enterprise efficient processes can be connected to the network. I think the network has to be designed outside in, which is why I believe that the planning processes have to be redesigned. Supplier development. Only a third of companies have active teams for supplier development that they go and they find out how they can be a better trading partner. You heard that from Ashley, right? When she was talking about semiconductors and the reuse of semiconductors. We talked about outside-in planning on Project Zebra. And those are heady concepts. I actually had a couple of emails last night of, I didn't quite understand it on stage, but when I talked to Nicole, I understood it over a drink. And I'm like, good, I'm glad Nicole's better explaining it than I am. But good, I want people to understand the concepts of outside-in planning. And then investing in new forms of analytics, how terrible is it that we are not willing to test and try, right? Like those 28 tries on the missile. And then work on that alignment, and then we're going to talk about training. So when you leave here and you talk to people about supply chain, one of the first questions you should ask is how you define supply chain. If companies have source, make, and deliver and plan reporting through the same leader, they tend to be further ahead. If they have contract manufacturing reporting through the same leader and they're building networks for suppliers and contract manufacturing, they tend to be better ahead. If they have corporate social responsibility reporting through supply chain versus finance, they tend to be further ahead. And then order management, right? I remember so many times I go into companies and the customer service department says, well, why am I coming to a supply chain meeting, right? If the customer service group understands that they're there to serve the customer and part of supply chain, you're further ahead. If you're an early adopter, if you build through influence management, the skill to try and fail, and you spend time and money like Annette Clayton did at Schneider Electric with her scuba teams, you're further ahead, right? If you look at this as a project-based, a tendering RFP, you're going to fall behind. You need to learn these terms, right? You need to test and learn how can you use unstructured text and sentiment. One of the best examples I've seen on stage here was Lenovo in 2016 when they mined unstructured text data to look at supplier quality. It's on the Supply Chain Insights Global Summit website. Ontologies. One of the best examples I have of a learning system on ontologies was the McCormick case study on flavor print that really looked at sensing. That ontology was built by an English major, just like Luke Layden was an English major talking to us about social tokens and Web 3.0. So not all of our talent has to come through engineering and business schools. And find out more about schema on read versus schema on write, and NoSQL and no code. Invest in learning these terms to really drive the understanding. And then I want you to summon courage. I want you to think about the AmeriCare Royale case study. He called me on a fluke. He had no idea what discrete event simulation was. He had the leadership to reach out to Bill at Gaines and to take a discrete event simulation tool that was emerging and put them together, and then build the case study. And look at how detailed his case study is. I mean, he went through the data analysis, he understood the data. This is great. Most people just look at a technology. And then he built that guiding coalition of influence management about how it can drive change. And there's nothing like a visual image to convince the executive team. And how about Allison? I love flow, mode, node, right? I thought she did a great job. Most companies talk about the digital twin without a definition. Her definition of the digital twin is the best I've seen in the industry. The other thing that I think is the best is this governance model of how do we take design tools, how do we build the architecture to design, archive, learn, govern, and really drive the governance. I remember back when I was in my 20s that I did my first network design, which looked at how do we best make product X, which my recommendation was that we would shift 40% of the volume from plant A to plant B. And I was like, well, that's so easy, we'll save money. And I had no idea I would be in such a political buzzsaw with the plant managers being up in arms about moving product, right? Or the distribution centers not being able to deal with the product, right? So this governance model of having leaders across source, make, and deliver buy in, making sure that the results are evaluated, that there's learning, and they have buy-in from the finance department is a great example of influence management. And then we talked about Project Zebra. And I'm hoping, just like the guy who's in the field without a shirt, that we can change our stripes. And you may not like what we're doing on the testing, and you may be a technologist that has a better idea. Good. Just like Air and Space Museum, there are lots of different airplanes that took flight. The key here is our current planning processes don't work very well, and implementing traditional processes are not getting us to our goals because we're focused on the engine without really looking at what the data is telling us, and not really looking at how do I empower business leaders to plan better. It isn't the planner who should be on my objective list. It should be the business leader. And so my challenge for you is let's imagine. Let's do this differently. One of the issues in our talent study is that finding employees with the right skills and experience is the #1 issue. The executive understanding of the supply chain is the second, which requires influence skills. The lack of training on next generation supply chain is the fourth. What is a next generation supply chain? It looks very different, very different people. And embracing new ways of working is the next gap. That's our stew pot. And we have a lot of academics who are out there who want to help, but they really don't know how to help, right? And so I classified my learnings from yesterday and what could academics do to help us unlearn, moving from inside out to outside in? redefining the term design. You know, Madhav, you can call it anything you want, but you know, I want to get us out of the traditional, we're going to design a project, going from functional to balanced scorecards, really challenging people to define supply chain excellence in a more meaningful way to the P&L, and helping people to have the courage to try and fail. Brett could have failed. We need to talk more about failure, right? And then on the influence skills, I want people to learn how to be better storytellers. I want them to have the courage to be in the field and build a guiding coalition. I want them to learn empathy and humor and governance and the need for governance and build leaders for the next generation. Because one of the things that really bothered me when I put together the pictures of the prior events, 80% of those people are retired or dead. We have got to train leaders faster. And then we easily talk about technology, right? Analytics, design talent, planning skills. But we don't talk about